Welcome, welcome, welcome. This webinar is on what you should know about ending violence in the deaf community. A conversation with Mary Pat Luetke-Stahlman. And Mary Pat is the Executive Director of Deaf Overcoming Violence Through Empowerment, known through the acronym DOVE. So this will be a very informative hour. And again, welcome, welcome, welcome. So we're really glad that you're here. We know everybody's busy, and as you can see from this mug, everybody, of course, is on mute. So I'll even say, don't you dare to try to unmute yourself. But anyhow, if it's just great to have everybody here, let's get into it. I'm going to start with my usual note of gratitude to the founder of Safer Society. This is Faye Honey Knopp, Honey as she was known to most people. And she is the founder of Safer Society. Originally true to her Quaker roots, she made it her life's work to go through prisons and into just about any situation to try to understand what caused people to engage in harmful behaviors. And she often said that unless we know what motivates people to cause harm, we'll never be able to end harm. And so she had a particularly special outlook on the problem of violence. And at Safer Society, we continue to further her work today. Our mission statement is that we are a nonprofit dedicated to providing services and resources for preventive and restorative responses to sexual and social violence. Mary Falcon, who you see here, is our executive director, and Steve Zioli is our marketing director. And of course, Sarah Snow, as always, is behind the scenes and is the person who really makes these things happen through more than just technological expertise. So thank you to all of these people for making this happen. At Safer Society, we believe that knowledge grows when it's shared. And as a result, we publish books, we do online trainings for continuing education credits, and we also have these webinars as well as the New Circle magazine, which focuses on or is a service for professionals who work with at-risk children and teens. And so some things that we have upcoming include another person from Colorado, Aya Gruber, who will be talking about her book, The Feminist War on Crime, and the unexpected role of women's liberation in mass incarceration. Sandy Jung will be talking about the principles of risk and need and responsivity on May 25th. And we have a number of other trainings, but I just want to mention Alan Srofe as well, who will be joining us on November 5th of 2021 on understanding the influence of early attachments. So lots of good stuff coming up. The basics are that it's always best to use either the chat or Q&A features towards the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And I see a question coming in already. That's great. The intended audience here today is professional. So please do understand the information and commentary in the spirit in which it's intended. We can't always cover every bit of foundational ground in putting on these webinars. The structure, which today is going to be loose, the first half is a conversation and Mary Pat giving us a presentation about her work and many of the challenges that deaf people face. I think you'll find it's quite illuminating. And then we're going to save as much time for audience questions via the chat and Q&A feature that we can. And then at the end, please do give us feedback via the survey that you'll be getting in an email. And so with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Mary Pat, for joining us today. I know we've been looking forward to this for quite some time. So on that note, I'll have you share your screen. And I see also a question, and Sarah, I don't know if you can answer, but the question is, will this be interpreted for those who need ASL? And I believe everybody should see our ASL interpreter right now. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Mary Pat. Thanks again.
Hello, David, and thank you so much for welcoming me. I wanted to add an interesting fact. I am a Quaker as well.
Oh,
Yeah, so what do you know? Coincidence. Okay, let me get this pulled up. Okay. I would ask that everyone does hold their questions until after the presentation. It just makes things a bit easier for me working with the interpreter, if you don't mind. And first, I want to thank you all for having me here. I'm going to be talking about a very important topic today, ending violence in deaf communities. I do want to make sure that I'm very clear. When I say deaf, I include deaf blind individuals, deaf people with disabilities, and hard of hearing individuals. And we need to be mindful of each component, each facet of our community as we go through our discussion today. So, of course, I want to explain a little bit about my organization, naturally. I work for Deaf Overcoming Violence Through Empowerment, otherwise known as DOVE. And DOVE's mission statement, as you can see, is to support Colorado deaf survivors in their healing journey. We focus extensively on resiliency, the resiliency of our survivors, and we believe that our services empower them and provide them tools to become successful in their lives. But prior to getting to that point, we have to back up to the beginning and talk about education, which is a key tool and one of the gaps in our community that we've recognized. So when you look at the numbers of violent incidents within our community, prior to COVID, it was 4 times greater. After, or really during COVID, we've seen it be 7 times greater. And the forms of violence that we face, we'll learn a little bit more about today. And they're somewhat distinct from the forms of violence that are experienced by hearing community members. And when I say hearing, that applies to individuals who have no relationship with the deaf community and who are able to hear entirely. So keep that in mind as I mention the word hearing, if that's unfamiliar to you. So we face a number of forms of violence. It's a serious epidemic, in fact, in the deaf community. As many of you today are aware, I'm sure, LGBTQ community members, the statistics are high, about 4 times higher at risk than straight cisgender community. And unfortunately, because of the lower amount of research efforts on that community, particularly deaf LGBTQ community members are even less researched. And so there's fewer statistics on when you add deaf into that identity. And so we do like to believe that the numbers are actually much higher than reported, which is not a good thing. As you can see, deaf children are 3 times more likely to face violence. And this does include some level of hearing privilege, and we have to recall that when we think about them being 3 times more likely, that includes bullying, it includes rejection, it includes language deprivation, language delay, which can be significant. And this number is about sexual abuse. 50% of our community having experienced that prior to the age of 18. So when we compare statistics briefly, we see that 50% of deaf girls have been sexually abused as compared to 25% of hearing women. When we look at male statistics, it's actually higher, 10% for hearing boys, men, as compared to 54% of deaf men. And I want you to remember this number when we start to learn about an example in Wisconsin, in particular, later in the presentation. So let's talk about Merry Christmas, shall we? You know, everyone always gets excited about the holidays, excited about getting together with their family members, seeing their cousins, right? Getting to open presents. There's a lot of excitement. And that is not always the case for deaf children. I would say about 70 to 75% of families don't learn sign language despite that they have deaf children. Some of them use oral means of communication and gesture, but you have to remember when the holidays come around, people want to play, they want to have fun, they want to enjoy the holidays, but oftentimes deaf children ended up sitting in the corner alone, eating cake, watching everyone laugh, having no idea what's going on around them in their own families. And that is a form of abuse. This happens, I could tell you, to almost every deaf child to some extent. And so when we talk about intimate partner violence, or IPV, there's a very small amount of research on the incidence of IPV within the deaf community. And many people assume that that might be a good thing, right? That means that it doesn't occur, that there's no violence. And in fact, quite the opposite is true. The deaf community experiences a high percentage of violence within the deaf community. So let's talk about hearing privilege. Hearing privilege is a part of the control wheel within the deaf community. And if you look at a normal control wheel, a typical control wheel designed by a hearing agency, you won't see the words hearing privilege as a part of that wheel of power and control. But when you look at the word hearing privilege, you have to consider all of the different barriers that cause some of those experiences, being excluded as a deaf person from important conversations. Like, for example, phone, being on the phone, talking to the bank without the deaf person's knowledge of what's happening. 70 to 75% of families don't sign with deaf family members. They also leave them out of social situations. And that has long-term impacts on their social and emotional skills that those children end up having, relationships that they have with people long-term, not really understanding the quote-unquote normal societal cues that hearing children pick up on, and they're left out by their families, friends, peers, because of not having access to language. And oftentimes, a hearing person will tell the deaf person, oh, the deaf community, is not any good. You don't want to be a part of it. That's another form of oppression that deaf people experience. In addition, this leads to some very interesting stories that have come up that I'll share with you. If you call the police, let's say that you call law enforcement, and there are two people parked adjacent to each other in two cars. One is deaf and the other is hearing. It does not matter who the perpetrator is. The hearing person gets the first call. They get to talk with law enforcement first, without exception. And that often leads to the deaf victim being charged with the crime. And when that occurs, Dove often has to essentially abstain from the case, specifically because once we receive the case, we're not allowed to work with people who cause harm as the quote unquote perpetrator per se. So this is a summary explanation of the different things that hearing perpetrators do to harm deaf victims. Again, leaving them out from social situations, not allowing them to be involved in deaf culture or within the deaf community, if their speech, their language, spoken language skills are poor, they will make fun of them. When law enforcement is called to the house, the hearing party will get all of the attention and the opportunity to frame the situation. I wanted to share a case study, one in particular, named John. This is obviously a fictitious name for protecting the person's privacy. So let's talk about John. John was 11 years old when an adult female forced him to participate in inappropriate actions with a younger victim. And this was all sexual conduct. It was inappropriate for children to be involved in. However, the adult forced John to participate in that. And at age 12, about a year later, went to counseling with his family and with the perpetrator, all in the same room, talking with the counselor, and he explained what happened. The counselor, who was a mandated reporter, never reported the crime. So fast forward 7 years later to when he was 19. A detective reached out and said, "I'd like you to come in and chat with me about what had gone on." And when he went in, there was an interpreter who was standing outside of the room and explained to him, "You need a lawyer." To John, "You need an attorney." And the reason why the interpreter decided to say that was because the interpreter was a CODA, a child of deaf adults, or had deaf parents. And CODAs often have been exposed to and have knowledge of the fact that the deaf community often doesn't have access to information that the hearing community does. And the hearing community just thinks of it as standard, common sense. Everyone would know their right to an attorney, and that's not the case for many deaf people. So he went in and ignored the advice of that particular interpreter and went ahead and made a statement to the detective. And because of how it was relayed, they went ahead and charged him with 2 crimes: molestation of a child, as well as statutory rape. It took about 2 years for the court process to proceed because there were interpreter issues throughout. Now, John is 46 years old. He's been on the sex offender registry for 25 years. He is deaf, and the deaf community does follow along with what's happened. They've sent him death threats on a daily basis. They've harassed him, they've targeted him, they've even beat him up. And every time he's offered the opportunity to go and present or be involved on a panel or anything of that nature, when a deaf person finds out, they go behind his back and essentially say, to the host, absolutely do not invite him to do that. And oftentimes because of that, they recuse their invitation and they remove the invitation for him to come. And so all of this is based on an assumption, right? People often don't allow someone to really explain what happened. And in the deaf community, it's a very somewhat closed off community. So what I'd like to talk about are some of the long-term impacts that the deaf community experiences because of the lack of access to information or knowledge of different scenarios and social cues. I will share a few more stories after this just to help you get a better understanding of some of these long-term impacts. I mentioned language delay as an impact, and that doesn't mean, as I'm signing to the interpreter, there's a delay in hearing the interpreter's voice interpretation. Language delay means a child who is, say, at the age of 5 has language access and the language acuity of a 2-year-old hearing child, which leads to language deprivation syndrome and disfluency. It's a very real problem in the community. And because of that, it leads to difficulties in comprehension, as well as the ability to learn about basic safety, say making a safety plan, safety expectations, standard rights to safety, and all of those types of issues. Also, not having access to educational resources, such as safety curriculum, the ability to learn about what's happening, consent, safe relationships, healthy expectations in relationships, all of which are inaccessible. And parents whose children go to state residential schools for the deaf, and when I say that, they're institutions, they're boarding, residential schools, where each state, almost every state, has a state residential school for the deaf. And at the institutions, the students live and stay there, and they learn about whatever the school decides is appropriate. And oftentimes, sex is simply not discussed. Safe sex, healthy relationships, consent is out the door. So because of the lack of access to information, and because of the oppression of hearing people, and because of other community members abusing them, mistreating them, they have a hard time trusting or disclosing information, disclosing their experience when it comes to violence. And because of that constellation of factors, we see a lot of behavioral issues that are long-term. Because of a behavior that might be puzzling, like why is this person doing that? It seems like not standard or inadequate or inappropriate even. But there's a lack of trust in relationships that happen, whether it's with a hearing party or a deaf party. Also, having higher percentages of intimate partner violence. And they also, unfortunately, have more chance of becoming perpetrators, again, because of that cycle of violence, power, and control. And so, discussing from a behavioral perspective, what's even normal is oftentimes not accessible. I'll talk about one story that happened in the 1960s. From the 1950s to 1974, there was a man by the name of Father Murphy. He was the headmaster of a particular school, and he molested as many as 200 deaf boys. They would try to fight the system, these boys. They really had struggles trying to explain their experience, and nobody believed them. Parents would come into the school, and Father Murphy would interpret and leave out information. And there was a danger of not having a shared language with their own children. So now let's talk about one other scenario at the Illinois School for the Deaf. 3 or 4 years ago, there was a girl who hung herself. And the reason she hung herself was because she was being molested by a staff member. No one believed her. No one did anything about it. That staff member was still working there. And I believe the staff member is still currently working there. It's a very common problem with state deaf residential schools because of unqualified staff, people who maybe are not fluent in sign, many of them work at deaf residential schools, and they prey on students who attend there. I want to also talk about one other interesting story. When I was 13 years old, I went to a summer camp, and there was a boy who, we seemed to like each other. He was 12 at the time. When the summer was over, we agreed that we would meet at a school carnival, just, a couple miles away from the state school for the deaf. We agreed to meet at that carnival. When I got there, several of my friends who went to the state residential school with him came up to me and said, "Oh, Mary Pat, do you know that he was caught having sex in the school bathroom with, this particular girl?" Now remember, he was 12 at the time, and I was 13. And this was considered a normal conversation, right? Blasé, right? Everyone has sex in the school bathroom, right? That's where you went. That was convenient. So there was another girl who was 15, and no one held him accountable. He was not charged with a crime. The school swept it under the rug. And this is a very standard response. Many staff members who work at deaf residential schools know that children are preyed upon, and they still work there. So naturally, the next question is, do we shut down these schools for the deaf? In fact, I would say quite vehemently, no. That would not be the appropriate response. The deaf community needs the educational access, but they also need to be held accountable. So everyone needs to work together in terms of how we hold them accountable. And that's really the question. So what can you do? First of all, always provide a certified interpreter. This is really number one most important thing that can be done. Make sure that you have access to accurate information, that the interpreter you're using is certified, who should also know their limitations, their capacity or incapacity to understand the deaf person when they're sharing information. If they're having trouble, then use a certified deaf interpreter would be the next step, or CDI. If someone comes to you and asks you, say, I need a CDI or a certified deaf interpreter, don't argue that, right? I know that it costs more in terms of funds, but it's critical. And if you really want to give someone comprehensive access, both to you and to the system, do anything at all means. It's critical that you provide access by whatever means. Now, if you're not sure how much you know or how much is being understood, or really anything having to do with what's happening, make certain that you do some sort of assessment. Find someone who is qualified to do a comprehension assessment. Don't pull in someone off the street that you find in the yellow pages and say, can you do this? Make certain that you do your research and ask an agency like Dove, for instance, about what can be done. We need help with X, Y, and Z. You may not always be aware of the tools that are available, and we can certainly find out, and we have a network of individuals to draw from. Also make certain that you consult with specialty agencies, again, like Dove. There's Ignite in Rochester, New York, Dawn in Washington, D.C. area, and there are some other sister agencies throughout the Northeast and throughout the country. Just utilize them. Reach out to them, communicate with them, ask them questions. Ask as many questions as you need to make certain that the access that's necessary is provided. And then also, even though I don't work directly with perpetrators, we still recognize a need there to make certain that the people who have been labeled as abusers and perpetrators, they need access as well, right? Find funding, do something to make certain that they have access to someone who can explain, what went on, what their experience in the system was, what the steps are along that process, how to fight for their own rights. Everyone should at least have full access to information. And because of the distinction between English and ASL, they're very distinct languages. There are things that I can sign, and that's where CDI comes in to explain documentation and to make things very accessible. I can't emphasize how important it is that everyone has full access to information. I'd like to just list out some concerns that my organization has recognized that exist. We've noticed huge gaps or lacks of qualified mental health services that are accessible to the deaf community and also affordable. You'd be surprised to hear that about 80% of the deaf community relies on Social Security in the form of SSI or SSDI, and that is a whole nother issue within the deaf community that I'll leave for another day. But I want you to understand that having the financial capacity to access services just isn't there, oftentimes. Also, hearing people who are not fluent in ASL or who have no relationship with the deaf community or just happen to know a few individuals who are deaf, they oftentimes will be given higher clout than deaf community members themselves, or offered the opportunity to share expertise, and that needs to be avoided at all costs. You know, like even I myself today am sharing, I am deaf. I am qualified to have this discussion because it's my community. Now, if you hired someone who was hearing, or you asked someone to come who had very limited access or exposure to the deaf community, that would be problematic. So please avoid that at all costs. Also, not having additional research opportunities that are afforded to agencies like ours. We have, let me think, Deaf Access. I've forgotten the name of the organization, doesn't come to mind, but they do some research work and they have some projects and some information coming out, but they're only one organization compared to, I mean, if you think about it, Dove has 5 staff members employed. And there are over 250,000 individuals just in the state of Colorado alone who consider themselves deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind, or deaf with a disability, or late deafened later in their life, age-related deafness. And we only have 5 staff members. So the funding for research and the support of those services just is simply lacking. And we're always looking for additional funding. We're always looking for, to strengthen our services, to provide support for aging adults. With baby boomers coming online and age-related hearing loss, the aging population is growing exponentially. And elderly abuse is a very difficult topic to discuss, but an enormous problem. And many of those individuals are deaf or hard of hearing, late deafened. They're wearing hearing aids. Their caretakers may take away their assistive devices. They may not give them access to information that they're not able to hear. And so already it's a large area of concern in nursing homes or in assistive living, where caretakers, abuse their residents. And then to add to that, an even larger problem for deaf or hard of hearing elderly individuals. And we simply don't have the resources or the funding or the capacity to provide services for all of those agencies out there who work with elderly, hard of hearing, late deafened individuals. There's just simply a lack there. I also want to make sure that we understand very clearly that providing interpreters should not be perceived as a burden. It's an accessibility tool. It is a resource that today, we have Kirk interpreting here with me, and he is voice interpreting, making certain that this webinar is accessible for me and for all of you. And so now when you're going to ask questions, right, we have someone who can provide the spoken questions into sign language because I can't hear you. So again, it's a tool that makes this communication possible. If we don't include interpretation, we wouldn't even be able to do this. So you have to remember that it is a tool and not a burden. Also, I want to make sure that you understand that there's no one size fits all when it comes to the deaf community. It's just not the case. Some individuals are hard of hearing, others are deaf. Some people will need a certified deaf interpreter because of their lack of fluency, lack of literacy in spoken and written language. It's really highly individualized based on educational background and their experience of violence.
Well, thank you so much for that, Mary Pat. You've condensed a very great deal of information into a very short period of time. And so we did get a few questions, and I'd like to invite people to enter any questions that you all have into the chat or into the Q&A. And so far, Mary Pat, you're getting some very nice reviews from the audience. That was awesome. Thank you. So one question that I saw here, it's a very broad question, but it's the comment that also services for intimate partner violence are also limited. And I know that your work is primarily in Colorado. Do you have the opportunity to interact with any particular professional body or group that works with intimate partner violence?
Right. I was talking about Deaf Advocacy. That is an organization that works alongside all of our deaf-run organizations that work throughout the United States. And while we work in Colorado, some information can be very generalized and generic based upon the needs that are seen throughout the country. We do work alongside those other agencies. We also, though, strongly focus our efforts on our community here in Colorado. Because, for example, in, I don't know, Washington State, let's say, there's less Latinx individuals who reside in Washington State who experience violence. And so the percentages from their community are smaller than ours here, versus in Colorado, we're heavily populated with members of the Latinx community who reside in Colorado. And so we need to keep that in mind as a part of our intersectionality, which is an important component of what we do. And we do work with everyone throughout the country to learn more about the impacts, some of the long-term impacts, but Dove does focus our efforts heavily on Colorado.
Fantastic. And if I remember the numbers correctly, you have a staff of 5 and a deaf community of roughly 50,000.
Thereabouts, yes.
Yeah, so I'm just reflecting on the incredible task that you have in front of you. So one question that also came in was, I'm expecting to have a client within the next year in a sex offender treatment program who is deaf and who signs. We will have a remote interpreter via a service that we contract with. And on top of that, what might be the most useful, what might be most useful for me to do to make sure that he is getting what he needs?
The first thing to do would be to talk with the person, right? To talk with him and to ask. They would know better than me what would meet their needs. The other thing also would be to take their feedback seriously, their input. So for example, some people are deaf, but they are actually deafblind. And they may not talk about it, they may not disclose it, because deafblindness is very, I guess, difficult and stigmatizing for a number of people. So for example, I have a very good friend from college who refuses to identify herself as deafblind, but she is deafblind. And so people notice that she needs signing in a smaller sign space or from a closer proximity or particular ways of communicating with her, or that she might even, bump into walls when she's navigating spaces. So how that relates to your comment is video remote interpreting or remote interpreting would not be appropriate for anyone who had that particular issue, deafblindness. So if you can get an on-site interpreter, that would be optimal, and please do it. Contracts, I really don't recommend setting up an exclusive contract. If you have a contract with more than one agency that's not exclusive, I can get behind that. But it becomes a monopoly, wherein also there's a greater chance if you use freelance interpreters to meet the needs of that person. You need to make certain that when you're talking with the person, you ask him, how are you feeling about this particular interpreter on an ongoing basis? Do you feel like you're getting access to full information? And include him in that plan for service provision. As you know, to be client-centric, right, which is critical, as you know, that should apply also to access, essentially, is what I'm getting at.
Thank you very much. And I will just add that in the technology run through for this webinar that we did earlier, we actually had some conversation about making video very clear so that the person can actually see. As you'll see, the interpreter has a beautiful blue background that makes his hands much more visible. And so everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different. Another question, actually, one question that came in I thought was very interesting, which is what would be the deaf community's equivalent of calling 911? Is it possible to call 911 in an emergency? How would that work?
That's a good question. We do have something called VRS, or Video Relay Service. It's for individuals who use sign language exclusively. We also have something else called Text Relay Service. Text Relay is something similar to what people might have been familiar with TTYs or teletypewriters. People can use either or caption telephones when it's a deaf person who uses their own voice and sometimes has some residual hearing but needs some visible support. Caption telephones are options. So those are all options of making phone calls, and that applies to calling 911, utilizing any of those technologies.
Excellent, thank you. We do have one question that I'm actually going to turn over to the entire group. This might be a therapist to therapist question, but it is, has anyone used third wave CBT with clients who are deaf? I'm thinking about acceptance and commitment therapy and searching thoughts when sign language is first language and not English. I guess I wonder if there's anybody that has experience with third wave behavioral treatments. You can certainly feel free to say so in the chat. I don't know if Mary Pat has any additional thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not a therapist, but there are a number of different types of counseling styles, of course, and types of counseling. I know I'm familiar with CBT, Gestalt, and a whole variety. And those vary, of course, depending on the person and what type of access they have, their communication modalities, how the therapist works with them. We do strongly recommend ASL-based therapy because that is direct. So if there's a deaf person using sign and has access to a signing therapist, that's ideal and best practice. If there's a deaf person who's being provided services, make sure that you ask them, would you prefer to use an interpreter or have direct access to someone who signs so there isn't an interpreter involved? And that doesn't really answer your question, but it does go back to providing a frame, a way of thinking about how to provide continued support, be it for survivors or perpetrators or the gamut of individuals who have all types of needs for counseling.
Thank you very much. And by the way, I apologize for the third person reference back there. We also got a question, would it be possible to receive the PowerPoint slides? And so I'm just going to ask that now. We would be happy to distribute them.
Certainly.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Another question is, what literature is there for professionals regarding communication through an interpreter between hearing counselors and deaf clients? In other words, how they communicate, what they understand regarding the language differences. I think any tips that you can offer in terms of how people can become better prepared.
Literature, I'm afraid I can't answer that particular question regarding literature that's available. However, I would suggest connecting with DCC, the Deaf Counseling Center, or NDT rather, I'm sorry, National Deaf Therapy. Those two agencies are deaf-based counseling agencies, and they offer additional information and resources that are evidence-based, and they are real knowledgeable behind how to provide services for deaf community members in mental health settings. I do need to warn you again that deaf people have a harder time trusting hearing individuals, generally speaking. So be prepared to really work on building rapport in that relationship a little bit more than you might otherwise with a hearing counterpart. Again, you have to recall the history of violence we have experienced at the hands of the hearing population. And yes, I would repeat the names of the agencies again. NDT, National Deaf Therapy, NDT, as well as DCC, Deaf Counseling Center.
Great, thank you. On this note, an anonymous attendee asks, do you have more to say regarding hearing providers who do not understand the issues around trust and sharing information? The concern is that this behavior often gets viewed as being defiant or not participating in services, which can impact negatively on a case outcome. Mary Pat, do you have any further thoughts about this?
Yes. And actually, I believe in the first presentation that I gave, having to do with that specific topic and trust building, I believe it was a law enforcement officer or a detective, I've forgotten which, but they were talking about, in a previous place of employment, they were working with an individual or individuals who were defiant, and they couldn't figure out why a particular individual was defiant. He was referred from another agency to agency to agency, and there was no rapport. He was pulling off the fire alarms off the wall. He was doing all sorts of unusual behavior. And he had a track record a mile long, as you can imagine. And he kept going in and out of the system on recurring episodes. And then finally, after about 10 years of languishing in the system, someone found out that he was deaf, lo and behold. And so they were not communicating with him clearly. They were not thinking about, oh, there's a possibility that he's not hearing us or not understanding us entirely, or not really picking up on, not having the ability to process the information because it's not coming into him. And so when they found that out, they began to work with him through that frame, and his behavior improved dramatically. Many of the crimes that he had been charged with were not actual crimes, as it turned out. And one of the crimes that he had been charged for was taking advantage of a vulnerable adult. And ironically, he himself was on par in terms of vulnerability as this other person. They assumed that he had more knowledge, more access, and he was able to process and understand things better than he was actually able to. He was actually understanding about on par with that other vulnerable adult. So he would have, and could have, and should have been considered a vulnerable adult himself. And so that's the important thing to consider when you're working with someone. All of the intersections that may be impacting upon their potential understanding or their processing of things. We oftentimes jump to conclusions, and that's not trauma-informed. That's not a trauma-informed approach. We argue about trauma-informed approaches, about providing ongoing support, listening to their stories and being client-centric and their truths. And honestly, it doesn't reflect always in our incapacity to not see these things. I know trauma-informed is not a new concept, and it's certainly time to build that in to your best practices and knowledge and experience when it comes to access. And one other thing that I would like to throw out there is don't ever use an interpreter and ask the for their opinion, to ask the interpreter what they think. They are almost like a telephone line, right? Yes, they're a human being, and show them respect, of course, but they are facilitating the delivery of a message across 2 languages and cultures, right? Um, the interpreters have no opinion, no right to make any decision for a survivor or to the other person or to the client involved. That is why it's so critical on an ongoing basis to really attend to the message that you're trying to send, and that the message is being transmitted and received effectively and in its entirety. So overall, I think it's just critical to consider that.
Thank you. And a follow-up question that came in is this any different with a CDI in terms of providing context or cultural implications?
When it comes to CDIs, there are a number of benefits that CDIs bring to the picture. And I want to make sure that I'm very clear. You would not provide a CDI without a hearing interpreter counterpart to work with. You would need to have both in place. The CDI, however, if they're translating documents or paperwork, that's entirely different. They might be able to do that without a hearing counterpart. But expecting a deaf person to interpret verbal information to a signing individual, it's important that you have them working in tandem with a hearing interpreter. But CDIs are able to understand the cultural context and nuance far better than a hearing interpreter in any situation, because they've had ongoing exposure as a member of the community and a native user of the language. If you get an interpreter who signs ASL versus someone who signs British Sign Language, you're not going to have been given equal access to information, because British Sign Language is entirely different than American Sign Language. So those cultural contexts are somewhat similar. And there may be very, very small nuances, ways to sign things, movements of the body, facial expressions that provide critical information. And a CDI has the expertise and capacity to perform in that area, a shared knowledge and experience to provide more contextual support to a deaf party. They are still, though, however, don't have the expertise to make the decisions for the person. They should simply still be a part of the communication facilitation team, regardless of, like almost like accents or dialects from people have in different countries. Oftentimes that is the case for CDIs. In the Northeast, there are specific regional varieties or dialects that exist in sign language, as opposed to the Southwest. And someone who is local to that community is another important consideration. Imagine if you got someone who speaks Spanish, they still would have to know the dialect of the person that they're interpreting for, what area they come from, what signs they use in that region of the country. And so all of that comes into play when utilizing a CDI as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And that leads to another question that came in about what about deaf people who are not English speaking? Is there a place, do you know of resources where one can find help for them?
Can you expand on not English speaking and what you mean by that?
I think the question has to do, and the person is welcome to say more, but it has to do with if you are an English-speaking hearing therapist who has now been assigned a deaf person from, for example, maybe Mexico, and you need Spanish translation as well. Are there any best practices in that regard?
Interesting question. So first off, so I mentioned there's Black ASL, BASL, as well as standard ASL. We also have Mexican Sign Language, which is it's an entirely different signed language than American Sign Language. So for example, right now with Kirk, if Kirk was asked to come and interpret for a person who knows Mexican Sign Language, that would be completely ineffective. So know again that talking with the person is the critical place to start. getting some observation and clarification. And that's why I also mentioned that access to knowledge. If you're not certain, do an assessment. Find someone with the expertise to do that type of assessment so that they can identify what sign language is the person even using. And I could even, I don't know that I can give you a direct answer of who knows that for any particular, for general scenario, but paying attention to the cues that they're giving you, figuring out which sign language they use. Sometimes they'll have enough English to tell you, I use Mexican Sign Language or another foreign sign language. And if you bring in an interpreter from Mexico, they need to know Mexican Sign Language. And the same goes with PISL, interpreter seeking clarification, plain indigenous sign language, which also exists. Again, depending on the region of the country that we're talking about. In New York, for instance, it's interesting, they have New American Sign Language. And that New American Sign Language comes from Nepal. They have a very specific, so there's one person right now, just one person who is trusted to interpret for them, only one, because they're using that particular sign language. So I would suggest, first of all, learning in your area what type of sign languages exist, talking with your local deaf community, asking them questions. They would know more information about your local community dynamics than I would.
Thank you, Mary Pat. And we have time for one more question, and it's actually kind of a difficult call, but I'm going to ask this one, which is, you mentioned accountability within the deaf communities. What are some of your thoughts on ways to support accountability?
You can't. That is a community problem. The only thing I can think of, however, is if you're working with parents, let's say, who have deaf children, I think it's important to remind them, it doesn't matter how young your child is. We need to educate on an ongoing basis, ongoing instruction about everything that could happen. One thing that I think I didn't mention earlier, that I have mentioned in prior presentations is, think about, the sex offender registry. Many children as young as 5 on up to 15 are placed on the registry for some of the most ridiculous things. One child who was 5 and also had autism hugged a classmate and is on the registry as an adult. So that's where educating the parents, teaching them about what is really happening, and the actual dynamics of children being put on the registry because people aren't paying attention to what their child is doing, to the nuances. They're not teaching them appropriate social behaviors. They're not and there was a deaf woman who was 19 and her girlfriend was 17 and sent a picture of her leg. It was just her leg, and she's on the registry. So teaching, having communication with parents to say, you need to encourage having direct access to information to your deaf children about how they can keep themselves safe. And obviously we don't want to scare them, but allow for organizations like ours to educate any number of these children. We see all kinds of barriers in the state deaf residential schools all the time because they refuse to allow us to talk about consent, for example, or healthy relationship dynamics because the parents say no. And oftentimes we go to after school programming as a result instead of during the school day. And so that's where I feel that's really one of the best ways for you to provide support in noticing change of the landscape for the safety of children within the deaf community.
Very good. Thank you so much. Again, Mary Pat. I do not remember an hour where I learned more in only 60 minutes. I know that everybody is grateful and you're getting very great reviews in the chat. I know a couple of audience members had other questions. If those people would like to contact me, I can contact Mary Pat. And likewise, Mary Pat is easily found on the internet through Dove, Deaf Overcoming Violent Encounters. Yes. So with that, I think we're out of time. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to also include my PowerPoint has been emailed. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm always open to fielding your questions. If you would like to share my presentation with others, I'm always happy for that to happen as well. If you'd like to ask me to come and present, again, I'm very open to that. And again, I just want to emphasize, would need an interpreter for those presentations. So keep that in mind as well for future possibilities.
Absolutely. Okay. Mary Pat, thank you so much. And hope to see you all at the next webinar. And we will talk soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.